The first thing the Veil felt was a wrongness in the sky, and the wrongness was a moon that should not have weighed what it weighed. Watcher of Edges Tomu sat at the far rim of the survey ring, 400,000 kilometers off the third world of the small yellow star, and read the number again because the number could not be correct. The gray moon of the human planet massed 73 trillion tons. That was the figure in every chart the Veil had ever drawn of this dull little system. It was the figure his own instruments had returned on the approach. It was a number a child of the Pale Veil learned the way other children learned the names of their parents, because the Veil catalogued everything, and a catalogued thing did not change. The moon now massed 73 trillion tons and a fraction more, and the fraction was moving. Tomu was not a soldier. The Pale Veil did not, in the strict sense, keep soldiers. It kept readers. It kept the long, slow eyes that drifted into a star system, measured every rock and every voice and every wisp of breathable air, and wrote it all into the register that the Veil carried from world to world like a god carries its scripture. Where the register said a thing was small, the fleets that followed treated it as small. Where the register said a thing was empty, the harvesters came and made it emptier. The Veil had unmade 900 civilizations this way, not with courage, which it did not have, but with certainty, which it worshipped. You measured a people, you wrote down their weight, and then you took the weight away. The humans had been measured 11 years ago by a survey drone the size of a temple bell. The drone had written 400 pages. It had counted their cities and their thin orbital docks and their crude fusion hulls. It had listened to their radio and decided their songs were sad. It had marked the species as low defense, high resource, and recommended the third tier of the harvest, which meant the world would be stripped while its people watched, because watching was cheaper than mercy and the Veil had never seen a reason to pay for mercy. That report had a single line that Tomu had read 1,000 times and never once believed, until tonight. The line said, "The moon is anomalously dense and warrants no further study." He keyed the survey ring's deep array and put 40 sensors on the gray moon at once. He told himself he was being thorough. He was, in truth, afraid, and he did not yet have a name for the fear, because the Veil had no word for the feeling of a measured thing measuring you back. The moon's surface temperature, which had been the temperature of cold dead stone for 4.5 billion years, had risen by 9 degrees in the last hour. Tomu did not report it. A reader who reported a frightening number before he was certain of it was a reader who got reassigned to the slow ships, and Tomu had a family on a slow ship already and did not want to join them, so he watched. He widened the array. He listened on the long bands, the gravity bands, the bands the Veil used to hear the groan of a planet's iron heart, and on those bands the gray moon was no longer quiet. It was ticking. Not randomly. The ticks came in counts. 11, then a pause. 11, then a pause. Over and over, patient as a clock that had been wound a very long time ago and was only now reaching the hour it had been set for. Tomu fed the pattern to the register's logic and asked it what an 11 count meant in any language the Veil had ever filed, and the register, which knew 900 dead tongues, returned a single match, and the match made the cold come up Tomu's spine in a slow gray wave. The match was human. It was the oldest human radio signal the survey drone had ever caught, a thing broadcast from the third world long before the Veil arrived, a counting song sent into the dark by a people who did not yet know anyone was listening. It counted to 11 and stopped. It had been, the drone's note said, a test, a way of saying we are here, can you hear us, is anyone out there counting too? The moon was answering its own oldest question. Tomu's hands were very still on the array. Around him the survey ring hummed with the dull confidence of a machine that had never been wrong, and for the first time in his service, he understood that confidence was not the same thing as knowledge. The Veil had measured this moon and written one lazy line and moved on, because a dense moon was boring, and boring things did not get harvested, and a thing that did not get harvested did not get a second look. He pulled the deep scan and read it raw, not through the register's polite summaries but the way a frightened animal reads a shadow, and the deep scan told him the gray moon was not solid. There was a skin of rock perhaps 40 kilometers thick, the genuine dead stone the veil had measured and dismissed. Beneath it the readings went strange, then stranger, then they stopped being readings at all, and became a wall, a single flat return that meant the sensors had hit something they could not see into. The something filled the rest of the moon. It was layered, it was ordered, it had the cold geometric regularity of a thing that had been built, not born, and it ran down and down toward the core, in tier after tier after tier, like the floors of a tower that had been buried point first in the sky. The moon was hollow, and it was full. Tomu finally did the thing he had been trained never to do without certainty. He sounded the survey ring's alarm. Not because he had proof, because he had run out of time to wait for it. The gray moon's surface had risen another 4 degrees while he hesitated, and the 11 count ticking had begun to speed, the pauses shrinking, the rhythm tightening toward something that was no longer a question but a countdown, and a reader of the pale veil, even a coward, even a clerk, knew the difference between a thing that asks and a thing that has decided. Across 40 light minutes, on the bridge of the Harvest flagship Long Decree, the Veil's first Harvest Lord received the alarm and laughed. The Harvest Lord was named Esh-Karen, and he had broken 11 worlds, and he had the easy contempt of a creature that had never once been surprised. He read Tomu's panicked figures, the rising heat, the hollow moon, the counting song, and he saw in them not a warning, but a clerk losing his nerve. The humans, his register told him, had 40 warships, none above 80,000 tons, the largest of them slower than his slowest tender. The humans had 8 billion bodies and no shields worth the name. The humans sang sad songs. The harvest of the Third World had been scheduled for this very rotation, and Esh-Karen did not intend to delay an entire harvest, because one frightened reader had found a warm rock. He gave the order to begin the harvest early. He told the fleet to move on the Third World at once, to take the docks and the orbital cities first, the way you take a creature's hands before its throat. And he told the survey ring, with the lazy cruelty of a being who had already won this in his mind, to keep watching the warm moon, since the reader liked it so much, and to tell him when it cooled. It did not cool. At the moment the Harvest fleet lit its drives, 2,000 ships swinging toward the blue world to begin the stripping of its people, the gray moon of Earth reached the end of its 11 count, and the count did not begin again. The surface of the moon split. It did not erupt. It did not shatter the way a struck thing shatters. It opened, along seams that had been cut into the stone so long ago and so precisely that no survey had ever found them. Seams that ran in vast, clean lines from pole to pole and around the equator, dividing the dead gray skin into plates the size of continents. The plates lifted. 40 kilometers of ancient rock rose on columns of cold blue fire and peeled back from the body of the moon like the petals of a flower that had waited 4.5 billion years to learn it could bloom. And from the dark hollow beneath them came a light that the survey ring's sensors recorded and could not name, because the veil had never had reason to file the color of an armada waking up. Watcher of Edges Tomu, 400,000 kilometers away, saw the first ship rise out of the cracked moon, and he made a sound he had never made before, a small broken sound, the sound of a creature watching a number it had trusted turn into a mouth. It was not 40 warships. It was not 80,000 tons. The first hull alone, the first of them to clear the lunar crust and turn its blunt gray face toward the Harvest fleet, was longer than the moon's broken plates were thick, and behind it, rising out of the hollow dark in ranks and tiers and columns that did not end, that simply kept coming and coming as the seconds stretched, was the rest of it, rank on rank on rank. A second hull, 100, 1,000, 10,000. The numbers climbed past anything the register had a column wide enough to hold, and still they rose. Still the moon poured ships into the night like a wound that bled iron, and Tomu's instruments gave up trying to count them one by one, and began instead to estimate, the way you estimate stars, the way you estimate grains of sand. The estimate, when it came, was a single line on Tomu's screen, and he read it the way a man reads his own death warrant, slowly, twice, to be sure. 1 billion hulls, give or take 100 million, rising. The humans had not built a moon-sized weapon. The humans had hidden a billion-ship armada inside their own dead moon, sealed it under 40 kilometers of stone, set it to a counting song, and waited, for as long as it took, for someone foolish enough to come and try to take their world. And on the flagship Long Decree, the Harvest Lord HFY stopped laughing. He had time, in the 4 minutes it took the Armada to fully rise, to do the only thing a creature of the Register knows how to do when its certainty fails. He tried to measure the new thing. He ordered his sensor crews to count the hulls, to mass them, to classify them, to find the column in the register that would tell him what they were and how to break them, and his sensor crews tried, and the numbers they returned came faster and larger than the instruments could file, until the classification logic that had broken 11 worlds simply stopped, because it had been built by a people who took, and it had no procedure for a thing that could not be taken. HFY watched his own machine surrender before a single human gun had fired, and he understood, in the cold way understanding comes to a creature that has never been afraid, that the measuring was over. There would be no column for this. There would only be whatever the humans chose to do next. What the humans did next was rise in silence. That was the part the Harvest Fleet could not bear. A fleet expects noise. It expects challenge, demands, the loud theater of a power announcing itself. The Armada made none. 1 billion hulls poured out of the cracked moon and unfolded into the dark without a single transmission, without a warning, without so much as a hail, the way a tide comes in without asking the shore's permission, and the silence of it was worse than any threat the Register had ever filed, because a thing that does not bother to threaten you is a thing that does not consider you a danger. The Harvest crews, who had expected to spend this rotation listening to a small world beg, listened instead to nothing at all, and the nothing climbed up their spines, the way the cold had climbed Tomu's, and somewhere in the Harvest Fleet, for the first time in the long, cruel history of the Pal Vale, a crew began, very quietly, to pray. At the edges of the system, the 9 other powers stopped pretending not to watch. They had drifted there for years, their survey rings tucked into the dark beyond the human world, each of them keeping its own catalog, each of them waiting to see whether the Pale Vale's harvest would be worth contesting or worth avoiding. They had all read the same lazy line about the dense moon. They had all dismissed it, and now, one by one, their instruments lit with the same impossible figure, and 9 separate catalogs that had each been certain of this little system discovered, in the same hour that they had all been certain of a lie. The Watchers did not move. The Watchers did not interfere. The Watchers did the one thing Watchers do, which is watch, and remember, and decide, very privately, never to be the 10th power foolish enough to come and measure the gray moon for itself. The woman who woke the moon was not a captain, and she had never wanted to be one. Her name was Marion Hale, and she was a structural engineer, the kind of person whose whole life was the question of whether a thing would hold or break under load. She had spent 40 years inside the gray moon, which her people did not call the moon when they were inside it. Inside it, where the dead rock gave way to the deep tears, where 1 billion sleeping hulls hung in their cradles in the cold and the dark, the humans called the place the granary, because that was what it was. A granary is where a careful people put away food against a winter they are sure is coming. The humans had looked at a galaxy full of things that measured worlds and took them, and they had decided, a very long time ago, to put away an answer. Marion had not built the granary. No living person had. It had been begun before the first of her line drew breath, dug into the moon by generations who knew they would never see it used, who passed the work down hand to hand the way a relay passes a torch, each runner trusting the next, none of them ever crossing the line themselves. Her grandmother had welded ribs into hull 400 million. Her mother had calibrated the cold sleep on 100,000 drive cores and died believing the great winter would never come in her lifetime, and she had been right, and she had kept building anyway, because the whole point of a granary is that you fill it before you are hungry. Marion's job, the last 40 years of it, had been the seams. 40 kilometers of lunar crust does not simply lift on command. It has to be cut so finely that no survey can find the cuts, held so firmly that meteor strikes and tidal flex, and 4.5 billion years of cold cannot widen them by the width of a hair. And then, on the one night it matters, released all at once, every plate, every column, every charge, in a sequence timed to the millisecond, or the whole crust comes down on the Armada it was meant to free. Marion knew the seams the way a mother knows a child's face. She had walked them, all of them, on foot, in a pressure suit, for 40 years. She knew which plate near the South Pole had a flaw 2 meters down that her grandmother had flagged and that 3 generations had argued about and finally decided to trust. She knew that when the moon opened, that plate would be the one to watch. She was watching it now. She stood in the heart of the granary, in a control gallery cut into the moon's true core, and around her the oldest people of Earth's longest project stood at their stations, and not one of them was young. The granary was kept by the old on purpose. The young were needed up above, on the blue world, living their lives, marrying, singing the sad songs the survey drone had mocked, doing all the ordinary human things that made the world worth keeping. The granary was the work of those who had already lived. Marion was 68 years old. The man beside her, who had spent his life on the drive corps and would give the order to wake them, was named Otis Brandt, and he was 71, and his hands shook now, not with fear, but with the simple weight of holding a thing he had carried his entire life and was about to finally set down. They came early, Otis said quietly. He was watching the same feed Tomu was watching, 2,000 harvest hulls turning toward the blue world. They didn't even wait for the cities to sleep. They never do, Marion said. The plan had a name, though no one had said it aloud in years, because saying it felt like tempting the winter to come. The plan was called threshing. It was very simple, the way all the truest plans are simple. The granary would open. The Armada would rise. And then the Armada would do the one thing no measured species had ever done to the Pale Veil, the one thing the Register had no column for, because the Register was built by a people who took and had never once had it taken back. The Armada would not destroy the Harvest Fleet. It would surround it, and it would let the Harvest Fleet see exactly how badly it had counted. Marion had argued for this, decades ago, when she was young enough to argue. The other path, the loud path, was to simply annihilate the 2,000 hulls the moment they came in range, 1 billion guns against 2,000 targets, a slaughter so total it would be over before the Veil's flagship finished a sentence. Marion had stood in this same gallery as a young woman and said no, not because the Veil deserved better, because the galaxy was watching, the galaxy was always watching. The survey rings of 9 other powers drifted at the edges of human space pretending not to look, and a people that simply slaughtered would teach the galaxy only that humanity could kill. A people that surrounded a fleet of takers, opened 1 billion gun ports, and then did not fire, that held the whole harvest of the Pale Veil in the palm of its hand and let it feel the weight of being held, taught the galaxy something far more durable. It taught them that humanity could have ended you and chose, that one time, watching, to make you carry the knowledge instead. Mercy, Marion had said, when it comes from the strong, is the loudest weapon there is. It is the only weapon that keeps working after the war. They had voted. The old of the granary had voted, 3 generations of them, and they had chosen threshing, and they had built the Armada not as a fist but as a hand, every one of the 1 billion hulls fitted with guns that could unmake a harvest fleet in a single breath, and every one of them under an order, the deepest order in the whole project, an order welded into the firing logic itself so that no panic and no grief could override it on the night. The order was, open every port, light every target, and do not fire first. Marion put her hand flat on the cold metal of the firing console, and she felt, through 40 kilometers of stone and 1 billion sleeping hulls, the moon begin to move. The seams released in their sequence, pole to pole, the great plates lifting on their columns of blue fire, exactly as 4 generations had promised they would, and Marian's eyes went straight to the flawed plate near the South Pole, the one her grandmother had marked, and she held her breath, and the plate rose clean. It held. 3 generations of trust, and it held. Marian let the breath out slowly and did not realize she was crying until Otis put his old shaking hand over hers on the console. "She'd have liked that," he said. He meant her grandmother. Her plate held. "They all held," Marian said. Above them, the Armada rose. It rose in the order it had been packed, the way a careful hand fills a granary so it can empty it cleanly. The Vanguard first, the great blunt hulls, each one named not for a battle, but for a thing the humans had refused to lose. Marian knew the names because she had welded some of them with her own hands. The lead hull was called Held Ground. Behind it came Still Here, and No Further, and The Long Wait, and 100 more whose names were promises. And behind the named ships came the unnamed ranks, the numbered hulls, the great anonymous tide of the granary. Hull after hull after hull, 1 billion of them, pouring out of the cracked moon and unfolding into a sphere of iron around the 2,000 astonished hulls of the Pale Veil's harvest fleet. It took 4 minutes for the Armada to surround the harvest fleet completely. The harvest fleet, for those 4 minutes, did not understand what was happening to it. 2,000 hulls had turned toward a defenseless world expecting to strip it, and the world's gray moon had quietly become a wall around them, a wall of guns, a wall that closed and closed and closed until there was no direction the harvest fleet could face that was not the open mouth of a human ship. Marian watched the Harvest Lord's flagship on her feed, the great cruel hull called Long Decree, sitting now in the dead center of a sphere 1 billion ships wide, and she watched it try to give orders, watched its escorts scatter and find every line of flight already filled, watched the easy contempt of the takers curdle slowly into the oldest feeling in the galaxy, the feeling a thing has when it learns it was never the predator after all. "Open the ports," Marian said. Otis gave the order, and 1 billion gun ports opened at once. The sound of it, inside the granary, was a single low note, the note of 1 billion mechanisms moving in the same instant, and it ran through the moon and through Marian's bones and through 40 years of her life, and she would remember it until she died. Every gun in the Armada came to bear on the harvest fleet. Every targeting system locked. 1 billion ships, each one capable of ending the Long Decree on its own, held the harvest fleet in a grip so total that the Veil's own instruments, which measured everything, could not produce a number large enough to express how thoroughly the takers had been taken. And then the Armada did not fire. It held. Marian had been afraid of this moment for 40 years, afraid that some old hand at some old console would feel the rage of 900 murdered worlds and squeeze, and that the whole meaning of threshing would die in a single bright second. But the old of the granary held, every one of them, because that was who they were, because they had not spent their lives building a hand only to make it a fist at the last. They held, and the silence after the ports opened was the loudest thing Marian had ever heard. Into that silence, the humans sent one message. They sent it on every band, in the clear, not coded, not threatening, on the same gravity bands the moon had used to tick its counting song, and they sent it to the harvest fleet, and to the survey ring, and to the 9 other powers pretending not to watch from the dark, at the edges of the system. Marian had written part of it, long ago, in this same gallery, and the words were as plain as the woman who wrote them. The message said, "You measured our moon and called it dense. You measured our world and called it weak. You wrote one lazy line, and you came to take 8 billion lives because a clerk could not be bothered to look twice. We are looking at you now. Every gun you can see is ours, and we have not fired one. We are going to let you go home, not because you deserve it, because we want the galaxy to know that when humanity finally opened its hand, it chose to open it empty. Tell them what you saw. Tell them the moon counted to 11. Tell them we were always here." On the flagship Long Decree, the Harvest Lord Esh-Karen read the message, and for the first time in 11 broken worlds, he did not have an answer. He had built his life on the certainty that the measured were prey. He had never once been the measured thing. And now he sat in the center of 1 billion human guns, every one of them open, every one of them holding, and he understood with a sick falling clarity that the humans were not bluffing and had never bluffed, that they could have ended his entire fleet before he drew breath, and that the only reason he was alive to feel this was that they had decided, watching, to let him feel it. The mercy was worse than any weapon. The mercy meant they were not afraid of him. The mercy meant they had measured him too, long ago, and found him so small that killing him was not worth the cost of teaching the galaxy nothing. Eshkaran did the only thing left to a harvest lord whose harvest had become a cage. He ordered his fleet to stand down. 2,000 hulls powered their guns to cold, and the great cruel certainty of the pale veil, the certainty of 900 dead civilizations, broke in the dark above the blue world, not with a sound, but with the silence of 1 billion human ships choosing, in the same breath, not to shoot. Marion Hale stood in the heart of the moon she had spent her life learning to open, and she watched the harvest fleet go cold, and she allowed herself for one moment to believe it was over. It was not over. Because the pale veil did not in fact keep its harvest lords on a leash that a harvest lord could fully pull. Eshkaran could order his 2,000 hulls to stand down, and he did, but the harvest fleet was only the hand of the veil. Behind the hand, 11 light hours out, riding the slow dark at the system's edge where the survey rings drifted, there was an older and colder thing, and it did not answer to harvest lords, and it had been listening to everything. The veil called it the Quietus. It was not a fleet. It was one ship, a single hull the veil had built in the deep past for exactly the kind of night the humans had just made. A hull whose only purpose was the thing the veil feared above all others, the thing the register could not measure and could not file and could not bear, which was a species that did not break when it was supposed to. The Quietus did not fight with guns. The humans, with their 1 billion ports open, had the guns, and the Quietus knew it. The Quietus fought with the only weapon that worked on a creature that could not be outshot. It fought with the inside of the mind. The first sign Marion had of it was Otis, the old man at the console beside her, who had just given the order that held 1 billion guns, suddenly went still, and his eyes lost their focus, and he said, in a voice that was his voice and was also somehow not, that he could hear his mother. He said she was calling him to dinner. He said the welds were wrong, all of them, that the seams had never held, that the moon was about to come down on them all, that they should fire, that they had to fire now before the crust crushed the Armada, that he could see it falling, he could see it falling. Marion looked at the seam readouts. Every plate was clean, every column was holding, the moon was open and stable, exactly as 4 generations had built it to be. Nothing was falling. But Otis was gripping the firing controls now, his old face slack with a terror that came from nowhere her eyes could find, and around the gallery she saw it spreading, station to station, the old hands of the granary suddenly flinching at enemies that were not there, recoiling from collapses that were not happening, reaching, one by one, for the order they had spent their whole lives swearing they would not give. The Quietus had reached 11 light hours into the human armada, past the hulls, past the guns, past 40 kilometers of stone, and it had begun, very quietly, to convince 1 billion ships that they were already losing, so that they would do to themselves the one thing no enemy fleet could do to them. It was trying to make humanity fire first. Marion Hale, 68 years old, structural engineer, keeper of the seams, looked at her oldest friend reaching for the trigger with a stranger's terror in his eyes, and she understood that the night was not won, that the real war had only just been declared, and that it would be fought not in the dark above the blue world, but in the minds of the old people who had built the granary, and that if even one of them broke, if even one open port spat a single shot into the cold harvest fleet, then everything, the 40 years, the 4 generations, the held seam near the South Pole, the loudest weapon there is, all of it would be lost in the bright stupid flash of 1 billion guns finally going off. She did not reach for a weapon. She had never carried one. She reached for Otis's shaking hands, and she covered them with her own. the way he had covered hers a few minutes and a lifetime ago, and she held them away from the trigger, and she leaned close to his terrified face, and she did the most human thing she knew how to do. She told him the truth, slowly, so it could find its way back through whatever the quietus had put in his head. She told him the seams held. She told him his mother was not here, that his mother had died 40 years ago welding hull 200 million, and that she had died proud. She told him the moon was open, and the guns were holding, and humanity had not fired, and was not going to fire, not tonight, not because of a ghost in the dark, not because something old and cold 11 light hours away wanted them to be the monster it had already decided they were. She told him to count. She told him to count to 11, the way the moon had, the way the oldest human song had counted into the dark, and to stop, and to start again, and she counted with him, her old voice steady over his shaking hands, 1 and 2 and 3, and around the gallery the others heard her, and the old of the granary, who had built their whole lives on holding, began, one by one, to count. What none of them knew yet was that the Harvest Lord, in his cold cage of 1 billion guns, had felt the same wave of terror ripple through his own fleet, and that he had decided, with the last cleverness left to a creature whose certainty had broken, to use it. Eshkaran could not measure the Armada, and could not break it, but he had served the Pale Veil long enough to know what the quietus was, even if he did not command it, and he recognized the shape of its work the moment his own crews began to flinch at enemies that were not there. The quietus reached every mind in range, his included, and where it found the old human hands unbreakable, it found the harvest crews exactly as brittle as crews always are. Eshkaran did not fight it. He rode it. He gave a single order to the 3 fastest tenders in his cold fleet, the small, swift hulls that carried a Harvest Lord's authority to the slow ships at the system's edge, and he sent them running for the dark, not to escape, but to wake the second wave, because the harvest of a world was never one fleet. The 2,000 hulls above the blue world were only the hand. 6 light hours back, holding in the dark where the survey rings drifted, the Pale Veil kept the arm, a reserve of 9,000 harvest hulls that came when a hand was lost, and Eshkaran reasoned, in the falling logic of a creature watching its certainty die, that 1 billion human ships holding their fire were 1 billion human ships that did not want to fire, and that a power which did not want to fire could perhaps be made to spend its restraint on the first fleet, while a second fleet came in behind it, unseen, to do what the first had been sent to do. He could not win the cage he was in, but the harvest did not need him to win it. It only needed the moon distracted long enough for the arm to reach the blue world's far side and begin the stripping there, where the Armada's open ports were not pointed. The 3 tenders lit their drives and ran. Marion Hale saw them go. Her sensors, tracing the load that was breaking her friends' minds, caught the 3 small hulls breaking from the cold fleet and burning hard for the dark, and she understood the shape of it the way she understood everything, not as cunning, but as a structure under load finding the one path the builder had not reinforced. The Harvest Lord was not running. He was reaching for a second fleet, and the whole of threshing, the open hand, the held fire, the loudest weapon there is, had been built to hold one harvest in the palm of 1 billion guns. It had not been built to hold 2, and it certainly had not been built to hold 1 in front of it, while a larger one came around behind. She did not panic. She traced the new load to its end, the way a good engineer always does, and the end was simple and very bad. If the 3 tenders reached the slow ships, 9,000 more hulls would come, and they would come at the blue world's far side, and the Armada would face a choice it had spent 4 generations swearing it would never have to make. It could turn its guns from the cold first fleet to meet the second, and in turning, break the perfect grip it held, and let the Harvest Lord's first fleet fire into 1 billion exposed flanks. Or it could hold its grip on the first fleet, exactly as built, and let 9,000 hulls reach the world it had hidden a moon to protect. Hold the hand and lose the world. Save the world and break the hand. The Harvest Lord had found, in his falling, the one seam the builders had not reinforced, because the builders had never imagined a winter that came in 2 waves. Marion looked at the 3 small running hulls, and then she looked at the billion ships holding their fire, and then she did the thing that had kept her people alive in the dark for 4 generations. She refused the choice she had been given, and went looking for the one she had not. 11 light hours out, the Quietus felt the counting begin and did not understand it. The thing that crewed the Quietus was not exactly alive, and it was not exactly one mind. The pale veil had grown it across 10,000 years out of the harvested fragments of the 900 dead, a lattice of stolen thought stitched into a single hull, and what it knew from inside the heads of everything the veil had ever broken. It knew the last thoughts of a hive queen as her brood went silent. It knew the despair of a machine civilization watching its own logic turn against it. It knew 900 ways a species comes apart at the end, and it had learned that every one of them, every single one, could be started early, from the inside, if you whispered the right fear into the right mind at the right moment. You did not have to beat a people. You only had to convince them they were already beaten, and they would do the rest, because that was what frightened things did. They lashed out. They fired first. They became, in their terror, the very monster the veil needed them to be, so that the veil could harvest them with a clear conscience and a tidy line in the register. The Quietus had never met a people who answered fear with arithmetic. It pressed harder. It found the old man at the firing console, Otis Brandt, and it poured into him every collapse it had ever witnessed: the moon falling, the seams failing, the crust coming down, his dead mother screaming, and it waited for his hand to close on the trigger and start the slaughter that would damn his species in front of the watching galaxy. And the old man's hand shook, and then a woman's voice cut through the noise the Quietus had made of his mind, steady and plain, telling him to count, and the old man counted, 1 and 2 and 3, and the fear the Quietus had built so carefully had nothing to hold on to, because a mind that is counting is a mind that is looking at something real. Marion Hale did not know she was fighting the Quietus. She did not know the Quietus existed. She knew only that her friends were afraid of nothing, and that the cure for being afraid of nothing was to look hard at something true, and she gave them the truest thing she had, which was a number, counted out loud, in order, the way her people had been counting into the dark since before they had ships at all. The counting spread through the granary station to station, and where it spread, the Quietus lost its grip. Otis came back to himself with a gasp, his hands slack now on the controls, his face wet, and he looked at Marion and said, in his own voice, all his own, that he had seen the moon fall. Marion told him the moon was open and holding and beautiful, and to look at the seam readouts, and he looked, and he saw that they were green, every plate, every column, and the last of the ghost went out of his eyes. But Marion was an engineer, and engineers do not stop at the symptom. She had a mind full of friends who had all, in the same minute, reached for the same trigger out of fears that did not match anything real, and she knew, the way she knew load and stress and failure, that this was not panic. Panic was random. This was aimed. Something had reached into the granary, into mines 40 kilometers under stone, and tried to make them fire, and it had failed, and a thing that fails does not simply leave. It adjusts. It comes again, harder, smarter, and the next time it might not waste itself on one old man at one console. The next time it might go for the firing logic itself, or for her, or for all of them at once. She needed to find it before it found a mind it could break. And she needed, in the same breath, to answer the 3 tenders running for the 9,000 hulls of the arm, because that load had a clock on it, and the clock did not care that her friends were drowning. She solved the tenders first, because they were the simpler structure, and because solving them bought time for the harder one. The Harvest Lord's whole plan rested on a single assumption, the same assumption the whole Pale Veil rested on, which was that a power holding its fire was a power that could not bear to break its own restraint. He believed the Armada was trapped between holding the hand and saving the world. He had not understood, because the register had no column for it, that the Armada was not a fleet of 2,000 guns or even 1,000,000,000. It was a granary, and a granary is built to be emptied in any order its keeper chooses. Marion did not turn a single gun from the cold First Fleet. She did not break the grip. Instead, she reached into the firing logic the 4 generations had welded, past the order that said do not fire first, and she found the older clause underneath it, the one her grandmother's generation had written and never expected to use, the clause that governed not the guns but the hulls themselves. The Armada had risen in the order it was packed. It could rise further. There were ranks still in the moon, the deepest ranks, the last tiers above the core that no plan had ever called for, hundreds of millions of hulls held in reserve beneath the reserve, and Marion woke a sliver of them, a mere 40,000, and she sent them not at the harvest fleet, but straight up and over the blue world's far side, to stand between the world and the dark the arm would come from, and she did it without firing a shot, because 40,000 human hulls arriving silently at the one place a second harvest meant to land is not an attack, it is a door, closing. The 3 tenders saw the new wall rise ahead of them in the dark, and understood that they were not racing to wake the arm. They were racing into a granary that simply kept opening, tier beneath tier beneath tier, and that there was no edge to it, no flank, no far side the humans had left unguarded, because the humans had not built a fleet with a far side. They had built a moon. The tenders did not reach the slow ships. They turned, because there was nowhere left to run that was not already filled, and the Harvest Lord's last cleverness died the way his certainty had died, against a thing too large to have a weakness he could reach. And the Armada still had not fired. Marion let out a long, slow breath, and turned, at last, to the harder structure, the one without a clock she could see, the thing in the dark that was breaking her friends' minds. Marion did the thing she had done every day for 40 years. She traced the load. A fear that aimed itself had to travel along something, the way a stress travels along a beam, and she pulled every sensor the granary had and asked them all the same engineer's question, which was not what is happening but where is the force coming in. The harvest fleet was cold, its guns dark, no threat there. The blue world was quiet, the Armada held, and out at the system's edge, 11 light hours into the dark where the survey rings drifted, there was a single hull that the Veil's own records, captured years ago and folded into the granary's archives, had no entry for, a ship with no name in any registry. A ship the register did not list, which meant, in a catalog that listed everything, a ship the Veil was hiding even from itself. Marion knew, the way she knew a flaw 2 meters down in a plate her grandmother had marked, that this was the thing in their heads. She could not shoot it. It was 11 light hours away, and even if a human gun could reach it, firing would mean a human shot crossed the harvest fleet first, and the whole of threshing depended on humanity not firing while the galaxy watched. The quietus had built itself perfectly. It sat where humanity could not strike it without becoming the monster, and it whispered into the minds that could strike it, and it waited for humanity to choose between its own destruction and its own damnation. It had not counted on the granary being run by the old. Marion gathered them, the keepers, the 3 generations worth of old hands who had built and held the moon, and she told them what she had found. She told them there was a ship in the dark that fought by making them afraid, that it would come again, that it wanted them to fire, and that firing was the one thing they must not do. And then she told them the thing she had worked out while she traced the load, the thing that made Otis Brandt, 71 years old, start to laugh in the heart of the moon. A weapon that worked by making you afraid only worked if you were afraid of dying. The old of the granary were not. That was the whole point of crewing the moon with the old. They had already lived. They had built a thing they would not survive the use of, passed a torch they would never carry across the line, filled a granary against a winter they had spent their lives preparing to meet. The young feared death because the young had everything still ahead of them. The old of the granary feared exactly one thing, and it was not dying, it was failing. It was opening their hand at the last and finding it had become a fist after all. It was teaching the galaxy that humanity, when finally pushed, was just another taker. The quietus had reached into the wrong minds. It had poured death into people who had made their peace with death 40 years ago, and it had wondered why the fear would not catch, and the answer was that you cannot frighten a people with the one thing they decided long ago to spend. So Marion gave the order that no plan had written, because no plan had imagined the quietus, and she gave it in the plain voice of a woman who fixes things. She told the keepers to stop hiding from it. The quietus fought by whispering into minds that flinched away from it, minds that recoiled, that did not want to feel the terror it brought. So the keepers would not flinch. They would open their minds to it the way they had opened the moon, on purpose, all at once, and they would let the quietus pour in everything it had, every collapse, every dead mother, every falling moon, and they would meet all of it with the one thing the quietus had no answer for. They would meet it with the truth of who they were, not afraid, not breaking, old people who had already given their lives away to a winter and were simply, finally, watching it come, and were not sorry, and would not fire. It was not a weapon the register had a column for. The quietus came again, and it came with everything, the way Marion had known it would. It did not whisper this time. It screamed. It reached into every mind in the granary at once, and showed them all the worst end it had ever harvested, 1,000 species dying 1,000 ways, the absolute conviction that all was already lost, that the only mercy left was to fire, to end it, to make the killing quick. It was the most concentrated despair the galaxy had ever manufactured, 10,000 years of stolen last thoughts aimed in a single instant at 1 billion ships and the old hands that held them. And the old hands of the granary, instead of flinching, opened. They let it in. They stood at their stations 40 kilometers under stone, and they did not look away from the despair the quietus poured into them. They looked straight into it, the way Marion had looked into a flawed plate for 40 years, and they answered it not with fear, and not with rage, but with the plain, unbreakable fact of themselves. Otis Brant thought, clearly, at the screaming thing in the dark, that his mother had died proud welding a hull she would never see fly, and that he was about to do the same, and that this was not a tragedy, it was the whole point, it was what it meant to fill a granary. Marion Hale thought at it that the seam near the South Pole had held, that her grandmother's flaw had held, that 3 generations of trust had held, and that the quietus could show her every falling moon it had ever stolen, and not one of them would ever be hers, because hers held, because she had spent her life making sure it would hold. 1 billion ships held their fire, and the quietus, the oldest cold weapon of the Pale Veil, the lattice of 900 stolen deaths, met for the first time in 10,000 years a people it could not convince of their own defeat, and something in it that had never been tested began, very quietly, to come apart. It had been built on a single certainty, the certainty that every species, pushed hard enough, would break and lash out and damn itself. That certainty was the load-bearing beam of the whole terrible structure of it. And the old of the granary, by refusing to break, put a stress on that beam it had never been designed to take, and Marion Hale, watching the strange readings ripple back from the dark, recognized the pattern the way she recognized everything, and she said, almost gently, to the gallery full of unbroken old people, that the thing in the dark was failing. Not them. It. The weapon that could only win by making humanity the monster, had just watched humanity refuse, under the worst pressure it could bring, to be anything but itself, and it had no second plan, because in 10,000 years it had never needed one, and a thing with no second plan, pushed past the one certainty it was built on, does not retreat. It does what the moon's old crust would have done if the seams had failed and the columns held anyway. It carries a load it was never built for, and somewhere deep inside it, where the stolen minds were stitched together, a seam of its own that no one had ever found began very slowly to give. Watcher of Edges Tomu, alone on the survey ring with 40 sensors pointed at a miracle, was the only creature in the system positioned to see both ends of what happened next. He saw the granary, the cracked moon, the billion ships holding their fire around the cold harvest fleet, and he saw, because his sensors were aimed outward as well as in, the thing the veil had sent 11 light hours into the dark, the hull with no name, the quietus, and Tomu, who was a reader and not a soldier, understood what the Harvest Lord did not. He understood that the real battle was not the one anyone could see. It was the silent one, mind against mind, the oldest cold weapon of his people pouring despair into 1 billion human ships, and the human ships, impossibly, not breaking. Tomu had spent his life trusting the register, the catalog that measured everything and was never wrong. And he sat now and watched the register be wrong about the largest thing it had ever measured, watched a moon it called dense become an armada, watched a species it called weak hold 1 billion guns open and not fire, watched a weapon his people had spent 10,000 years perfecting break itself against the plain stubbornness of old human engineers, and somewhere in the long terrible minutes of it, Watcher of Edges Tomu stopped being a reader of the pale veil and became something the veil had no word for. He became a witness who was on the wrong side and knew it. He began, quietly, to record everything, not for the register, but for himself. Inside the granary, Marion Hale watched the strange readings ripple back from the quietus and knew the thing was failing, and she also knew, the way she knew load, that a structure failing is the most dangerous a structure ever is. A weapon built on a single certainty, pushed past that certainty, does not simply switch off. It does the last thing it knows how to do, with everything it has left, because it has no other move. The quietus could not make humanity fire. It had tried with one mind and failed, tried with all of them and failed worse, felt its own seams begin to give. So it would do the only thing left to a thing whose whole purpose was to make a people destroy themselves. It would try to destroy itself in a way that took the Armada with it. Marion saw it coming in the readings before anyone else did. The quietus had been pouring its despair outward, into the human ships. Now the pattern reversed. It began pulling inward, gathering 10,000 years of stolen minds into a single dense knot, and Marion, who had spent 40 years on the physics of release, recognized the shape of a thing winding itself up to come apart all at once. The quietus was a hull full of harvested thought stitched over a power core large enough to drive that thought 11 light hours, and if it gathered all of that into one point and let it go, the release would not be a thought. It would be a wave, a hard wave of every kind of energy at once, racing out from the system's edge at the speed of light, and it would reach the cracked moon in 11 hours, and it would wash over the Armada, and Marion did not know what it would do to 1 billion ships, but she knew what the quietus believed it would do, because a thing's last act always tells you its last hope, and the quietus's last hope was to take everything with it. 11 hours. That was how long the humans had. It was, Marion thought, almost funny. The whole night had turned on a count of 11, the moon's song, the oldest human radio signal, and now 11 hours of warning before a dying weapon's last wave reached the Armada it had failed to break. She did not believe in omens. She believed in load paths and timing, but she let herself smile, once, at the number. The plan had no answer for this. Threshing had imagined the harvest fleet, the watching galaxy, the open hand, and the held fire. It had not imagined a weapon that, having failed to make humanity the monster, would settle for making humanity a casualty. There was no welded order for this in the firing logic. There was no vote 3 generations deep. There was only Marion Hale, 68, keeper of the seams, and the old people around her, and 11 hours. So she did what engineers do when the plan runs out. She looked at what she had. She had 1 billion ships, every one of them holding fire, every one of them a weapon she was not allowed to use, because firing across the cold harvest fleet would damn humanity in front of the galaxy. She had 40 kilometers of lunar crust, lifted and held on columns of blue fire. She had a survey ring at the system's edge, the Veil's own, full of the Veil's own readers. And she had the quietus, 11 light hours out, winding itself up to come apart. And she had the one thing the quietus had taught her, without meaning to, which was that the weapon worked on minds, and a thing that works on minds is a thing that has a mind, and a thing that has a mind can be reached. Marion did not gather a strike force. She gathered the keepers, the old hands, the 3 generations of held trust, and she told them what she meant to do, and it was so simple and so strange that Otis Brandt, who had been ready to die proud all night, had to sit down. The quietus had spent the battle pouring despair into the granary, and the granary had answered with the plain truth of who the humans were. The connection ran both ways. The Quietus had opened a door into a billion human minds to break them. And the door was still open, and on the other side of it was a thing made entirely of stolen last thoughts, 900 civilizations worth of dying, knotted into one screaming lattice that had never in 10,000 years heard anything back except more fear. Marion was going to send something back through the door. Not despair, not rage, not a weapon at all. She was going to send the truth, the way she had sent it to Otis when the ghost had him, the way she had counted him back. She was going to send the Quietus the one thing it had never been given in 10,000 years of harvesting deaths, which was the experience of a people who had looked straight at the worst it could bring and had not broken, had not fired, had chosen, watching, to open an empty hand. She was going to let the lattice of the 900 dead feel, for the first time, what it was like to be on the other side of mercy. She did not know if it would do anything. She knew only that a thing winding itself up to come apart was a thing that had given up, and that the cure for giving up, she had learned over 68 years and 40 of them under stone, was to be shown, plainly, that the end you were sure of was not the only end there was. So the old of the granary opened the door the rest of the way, on purpose, all at once, the way they had opened the moon. And where the Quietus had poured despair in, they poured themselves out. Not as an attack, as a telling. They told the lattice of the 900 dead about the seam near the South Pole that held, about the granary filled against a winter by hands that would never see it emptied, about the torch passed runner to runner, none of them crossing the line, about a billion guns opened and not fired, because a people that has the strength to end you and chooses, watching, to let you carry the knowing instead, has found the only weapon that keeps working after the war. They told the Quietus, the harvested mind of the 900 broken, that it did not have to be the last act of a weapon. They told it the door swung both ways. And the Quietus, which had spent 10,000 years pouring out the last thoughts of the dead and had never once been sent anything back, faltered. The knot it had wound itself into loosened, just slightly. The hard wave it had been gathering to throw at the Armada hung, half-made, in the dark 11 light hours out, because for the first time, the lattice of 900 stolen minds was hearing something that was not fear, and it was something they all, every harvested fragment of them, recognized, because every one of those 900 civilizations had, somewhere in its dying, hoped for exactly this, and never received it. The lattice was hearing mercy, real mercy, the kind that comes from the strong, the kind they had all begged the veil for, in their last moments, and been refused, because the veil did not pay for mercy and never had. Marion Hale felt the door shift. She did not have words for what she felt, because no engineer has words for feeling a weapon made of dead minds begin to come, very slowly, back to life as something else. But she felt the wave that was meant to kill the Armada begin to come apart, not outward, but quietly, the gathered energy unwinding back into the hull that had held it, and she understood that the Quietus was not going to throw it. It could not. You cannot make a weapon of despair fire after you have shown it mercy. The despair was the load-bearing beam, and the keepers had just cut it, not with a shot, but with the truth, and the whole terrible structure of the Quietus, 10,000 years and 900 deaths of it, settled gently into something it had never been allowed to be, which was simply a great deal of old grief that no longer had a use. The hull at the system's edge went dark, not destroyed, dark, its drives cold, its mind quiet, the wave unmade, the 900 stolen voices that had screamed despair into a billion human ships for 10 long minutes falling, at last, silent, the way a song falls silent when it has finally, after 10,000 years, been answered. Watcher of Edge's Tomu, alone on the survey ring, recorded the Quietus going dark, and did not understand, at first, what he had seen. His instruments told him the Veil's oldest weapon had simply stopped. No human shot had touched it. No human ship had moved toward it. It had wound itself up to kill the Armada, and then it had quietly unwound itself and gone silent, and Tomu, replaying the readings, found the only signature his sensors had caught in the final minute, the strange two-way pattern on the gravity bands, the same bands the moon had used to tick its counting song, running now not outward from the veil, but inward, from the human armada into the dying weapon, and he realized, slowly, what he was looking at. The humans had not killed the Quietus. They had answered it. They had taken the worst thing his people had ever built, a hull made of 900 stolen deaths, and instead of shooting it, instead of letting it take the armada with it, they had reached down the open door it had cut into their own minds and given it the one thing the Pale Veil had refused, 900 dying worlds, and it had been enough. It had been enough to unmake a weapon that no fleet could have touched. Tomu sat with that for a long time, alone, at the edge of a system that had just changed everything he thought he knew, and then he did the thing that made him, finally and completely, no longer a creature of the veil. He stopped recording for himself, and he began to record for the galaxy. The price of answering the Quietus did not show itself until the danger was over, which is the way prices always come due. Marion Hale felt it first as a wrongness in the door. The connection the keepers had opened, the two-way channel down which they had poured the truth of who they were, had been built for breaking a weapon, not for holding it open under load, and the load had been enormous. 10,000 years of stolen grief did not unwind into silence for free. It had to go somewhere, and the somewhere was the minds that had reached out to take it, the old hands of the granary who had opened themselves all the way to answer the 900 dead. Marion understood it the way she understood every failure, as a load that had to be carried by something. The Quietus was made of last thoughts. To unmake it, the keepers had taken those last thoughts up the open channel and into themselves, the way a beam takes a stress to spare the wall behind it, and now 900 civilizations worth of dying was running back through the door into the minds of 200 old people 40 kilometers under stone, and a mind, even an old and unbreakable one, is not a hull. It was not built to hold the deaths of 900 worlds. The keepers began to fail, the way the Quietus should have, quietly, one by one. Otis Brandt put his old hand on the firing console he had guarded all night, and his eyes lost their focus, not with a stranger's terror this time, but with something gentler and far more final, and he told Marion, in a voice that was entirely his own and very far away, that he could hear all of them, all 900. He said they were not screaming anymore. He said they were just tired, the way he was tired, and that he was going to sit with them a while, because someone should, because no one ever had. Marion knew what was happening. She was an engineer. She could read a load to its breaking point in her sleep. The keepers had taken the grief of the 900 to spare the Armada, and the grief was more than old minds could carry, and it was going to carry them off, one by one, gently, the way a tide carries off what it has finally been allowed to reach. There was a way to stop it. There was always a way. You could close the door. You could cut the channel, seal the keepers' minds off from the dying lattice, and the rest of them would be saved. Every old hand still standing would be spared the weight that was taking Otis now. But closing the door would leave the quiets unanswered. It would let 10,000 years of stolen grief fall back into the dark unheld, and Marion knew, with the cold certainty she usually reserved for steel, that a grief that vast, dropped and abandoned at the last moment, would not stay quiet. It would find its shape again. The lattice would re-knot. The weapon would wake, and this time it would know that humanity's mercy had a limit, that the open hand closed when the carrying got too heavy, and it would never falter again. To save the keepers, Marion would have to teach the Quietus that human mercy was a bluff after all. She would not. She had spent her whole life on the principle that a thing you build to hold must actually hold, all the way, under the worst load, or it was not worth building. She had welded that principle into the seams of the moon. She had argued it into the whole shape of threshing. The open hand had to be open all the way, or it was just a fist that had learned to hide, and so the keepers had to carry the grief all the way, to the end, no matter the price, because a mercy that quits when it gets heavy is not mercy. It is only a delay. Marion did the math in her head, the way she had done 1,000 times in 40 years, and the math was simple and terrible. The grief of 900 worlds, carried by 200 old minds, would take them all before it was spent. But it could be spent. It was a finite load. If the keepers held the door open and carried it to the end, the lattice would unwind completely. The 900 would be truly answered, truly laid down, and the quietus would never wake again. The keepers would not survive it. But the Armada would. The blue world would. The galaxy would have its witness. And the 900 dead, who had begged the veil for mercy and been refused, would finally, after 10,000 years, be held all the way to the end by someone who meant it. She gathered the keepers one last time, the ones still standing, and she did not order them, because you do not order the old to die. She told them the truth, the way she had told Otis when the ghost had him, plain and steady. She told them the door had to stay open. She told them what staying open would cost, and she told them they could close it, that she would close it herself if they asked, that no one would think less of 200 old people who had already opened a moon and held 1 billion guns and broken the worst weapon in the galaxy. She gave them the choice. And then she stood with her old hand on the channel control, and she waited. Not one of them asked her to close it. They were the old of the granary. They had built a thing they would not survive the use of. They had filled a granary against a winter, knowing they would not eat from it. They had passed the torch runner to runner. None of them ever meant to cross the line. They had spent their whole lives being the generation that pays, so the next one does not have to, and they were not about to stop on the one night it finally meant something. Otis Brandt, already half gone into the company of the 900, smiled at Marion from very far away and told her to keep the door open, that the dying were good company, that he had been carrying a thing his whole life and was glad, at the last, to set it down by carrying something heavier. So Marion kept the door open. She learned, in the holding of it, the names of the 900, not all at once, and not in any language she could have spoken, but the way you learn the shape of a room in the dark, by touch, by the weight of each thing as it passed through her keepers and into the quiet. She felt a people who had sung to their sons, and a people who had built cities in the rings of a gas world, and a people who had loved their children exactly the way humans love theirs, and had watched those children measured and taken and written into a tidy line in the register. She felt the hive queen who had gone silent and the machine civilization that had watched its own logic turn, and she understood, holding them, that the quietus had not been a weapon at all, not really. It had been a grave. The veil had murdered 900 peoples, and then, unable even to let them rest, had stitched their last moments into a hull and aimed them at the next world on the list, made the dead do the killing so the living would not have to feel it. And no one, in 10,000 years, had ever stopped to grieve them, because grieving the harvested was not a thing the veil paid for. The keepers paid for it now. That was the truth Marion held on to as the gallery went quiet around her, the truth that made the dying bearable. Her people were not losing 200 old hands to a weapon. They were spending 200 old hands to bury 900 peoples who had never been buried, to give the dead of 10,000 years the one thing every dying thing wants and so few receive, which is to be sat with, to be known, to be carried all the way down by someone who does not look away. The keepers were not casualties. They were mourners, the first the 900 had ever had, and the last work of the patient old who filled the granary was to empty their own lives into a grief that had waited 10,000 years for someone strong enough and kind enough to finally feel it. She kept it open while the keepers, one by one, took up the grief of the 900 and carried it down into the quiet. She kept it open while Otis Brandt's old hands went still on the console he had guarded for 50 years, his face peaceful, the ghost of his proud dead mother, finally just a memory and not a wound. She kept it open while the gallery went quiet station by station, 200 old hands setting down a weight no one had ever offered to help them carry, spending themselves to spend the grief, until the channel that ran from the granary to the dark weapon at the system's edge carried less and less and less, until the 900 stolen voices were not a scream and not a song but only, at the very end, a kind of rest. And Marion Hale was the last one standing, because someone had to be, because someone had to hold the door open until it was truly done, and she had decided, somewhere in the long night, that it would be her. She was the keeper of the seams, The seams were hers to open and hers to close. She stood in the heart of the moon she had spent her life learning to hold, surrounded by the peaceful dead of 3 generations, and she carried the last of the 900 down into the quiet with her own mind, the way she had carried every load that came to her, all the way, to the end, because a thing you build to hold must hold. The last thing Marion Hale felt was not despair, and it was not fear, because the quietus had nothing left to give her of either. The last thing she felt was the lattice of the 900, fully answered at last, fully laid down, and under it, so faint she might have imagined it, the gratitude of 900 dead civilizations who had begged for mercy at their ends and been refused, and had finally, 10,000 years too late, and from the strangest possible source, received it. She felt them rest. She closed the door from the inside, the only way it could be closed and stay closed, and she set down the last of the weight, and the seam held, the way it always held, the way she had spent her whole life making sure it would. The quietus, at the system's edge, went truly dark, and stayed dark, forever. When it was over, the cracked moon of Earth still hung open above the blue world, its plates lifted on their cold blue columns, its billion ships still holding their fire around the cold harvest fleet, and the galaxy, which had been watching all of it, understood that it had just seen something it would be telling its children about for a very long time. The Harvest Lord Esh-Karan took his 2,000 hulls and went home. The humans let him go, exactly as they had promised, every gunport open, not one of them fired. He carried with him the worst cargo a Harvest Lord can carry, which is the truth, and the truth was that the Pale Veil had measured a moon and called it dense, had measured a world and called it weak, had sent its harvest fleet and its oldest cold weapon against 8 billion lives, and had been answered not with slaughter but with mercy, and that the mercy had cost the humans 200 of their best, and they had paid it anyway, in full, without complaint, because that was simply who they were. Watcher of Edge's Tomu did not go home. He took the record he had made, the true one, the one with the 2-way signal on the gravity bands and the dark hull at the system's edge, and the billion guns that never fired, and he sent it to the 9 other powers drifting at the edges of human space, the ones who had pretended not to watch. He sent it in the clear, the way the humans sent their message, because he had decided that the Register's way of hiding the truth from itself was over, at least in him. And then he turned his survey ring, his little reading machine that measured everything, and had been so wrong about the largest thing it ever saw, and he pointed it not at the human world but away, out into the dark, and he began, for the first time in his service, to write down not what a place was worth, but what had happened there. He wrote that the moon counted to 11. He wrote that 1 billion ships opened their ports and did not fire. He wrote that the oldest cold weapon of the Pale Veil was unmade not by a shot, but by an answer, and that the answer cost 200 old human lives, and that they paid it without being asked. He wrote that he did not fully understand what the humans were, but that he understood, now, what they were not. They were not prey. They had never been prey. They had been a granary, filled in the dark by the patient old against a winter they were certain would come, and when the winter came, they had opened, and the winter had not been ready for what was waiting inside. The 9 watching powers received Tomu's record in the same hour, and 9 separate councils, each in its own dark, did the same arithmetic and reached the same conclusion, which was that the order of the galaxy had quietly changed and that none of them had been consulted. For a long time none of them spoke of it aloud, because to speak of it was to admit what they had seen, and what they had seen unsettled the oldest comfort a power can have, the comfort of believing it knows where the strength in the galaxy lives. They had all believed the strength lived in numbers, in tonnage, in the size of a fleet and the reach of a gun. They had measured each other that way for 10,000 years, and they had just watched 1 billion human ships holding more raw force than the 9 of them combined choose not to use it, and watched that choice unmake a weapon that all their guns together could not have touched, and they understood that they had been measuring the wrong thing the whole time, the way the Veil had measured the wrong thing about the moon. One of the 9, a quiet trading power that had never harvested a world, sent the humans a message of its own. It was a careful message, The kind a small clever creature sends a large calm one, and it asked the single question the whole galaxy now wanted answered. It asked why. Why hide 1 billion ships for 4 generations only to open an empty hand? Why pay 200 lives to spare a weapon made of your enemy's dead? Why, having proven you could rule, choose so plainly not to? The humans answered the trading power the way they answered everything that night, in the clear, in plain words on the gravity bands. They said the moon was not built to rule, it was built to be left alone. They said a people that hides 1 billion ships and then conquers with them has only become the thing it was hiding from, and that the whole point of the long dark work in the moon had been to find, at the end of it, a way to be strong that did not turn them into the veil. They said they had paid the 200 because mercy that you stop paying for is not mercy, it is only a price you were willing to advertise. And they said last, that the galaxy was welcome to remember the night however it liked, but that the humans themselves would remember it as the night they proved they could keep the granary closed, and that keeping it closed was the only victory they had ever wanted. The trading power read that, and filed it, and quietly redrew every chart it kept of human space, not with a fleet symbol, but with a single mark its catalog reserved. For the few places in the galaxy a wise power simply does not go. It would be years before the full account of that night reached the heart of the Pale Veil, and when it did, the Veil did something it had not done in 900 broken worlds. It closed the register on humanity, not because the humans were too small to bother with, because they were too large to measure, and the Veil's whole strength had always been the certainty that it could measure anything, and a thing that cannot be measured is a thing the Veil's certainty cannot survive looking at. The harvest of the third world was struck from every chart. The gray moon was marked, in the only honest line the register ever wrote, with 3 words and nothing more. The line said, "Do not return." The humans, for their part, did not boast. That surprised the galaxy more than the Armada had. A people that had hidden 1 billion ships in its moon and broken the worst weapon the Pale Veil ever built and let an entire harvest fleet go home untouched might have been expected to crow about it, to demand tribute, to become, in their hour of strength, the very kind of power the Veil had been. They did not. They closed the moon. The plates came down, slowly, over weeks, settling back onto their seams exactly as 4 generations had built them to, until the gray moon of Earth looked once again like a dull dead rock that no survey would bother to measure twice, with 1 billion ships sleeping in the dark beneath it, and 40 kilometers of stone over them, waiting, the way a granary waits, for a winter that, the galaxy now devoutly hoped, would never come again. And they buried their dead inside it. The 200 keepers who had carried the grief of the 900 were not brought up into the light. They were left where they had fallen, in the heart of the moon, in the gallery where they had held the door open to the end, and the humans sealed the gallery and made it the deepest part of the granary, deeper than the ships, deeper than the seams, a quiet stone room at the center of a hollow moon where 200 old people lay among the answered dead of 900 worlds. The humans did not think this was sad. The keepers had spent their lives filling a granary they would never eat from. It was fitting, the humans thought, that they should rest at the bottom of it, holding the door closed from the inside, the way they had held everything, all the way to the end. Marion Hale's grandmother had welded hull 400 million. Her mother had calibrated 100,000 drive cores. Marion herself had kept the seams for 40 years, and then carried the last of the 900 down into the quiet, so that 1 billion ships and 8 billion lives and 1 watching galaxy would learn, on a single night, what humanity was. 3 generations of held trust, 3 runners in a relay that none of them had ever meant to cross the line of, and the line, in the end, had been crossed by all of them, in the deepest room of the moon, where the torch was finally set down, still burning. Years later, when humans were asked about that night, they did not talk about the 1 billion ships. They did not talk about the harvest fleet that went home, or the quietus that went dark, or the register that closed. They talked about the seam near the South Pole, the one with the flaw 2 meters down that a woman had marked 4 generations earlier. that 3 generations had argued about and finally decided to trust. They said it held. They said that was the whole story, really, the only part that mattered. A people had built a thing in the dark, against a winter, and trusted the hands that came before them and the hands that would come after. And when the winter finally came and the worst weapon in the galaxy threw everything it had at the place where they had hidden their answer, the seam held. It always held. And it would hold again, the humans believed, for the next winter, and the one after that, for as long as there were patient old hands to keep it, and young lives above worth keeping it for, because the granary had never been about a single night. It had been about the promise behind the night, the promise 3 generations had welded into 40 kilometers of stone, that a people could be strong enough to end anything, and choose, every single time, watching, not to. That was the thing the moon truly held under its dull gray skin, not a billion ships, a decision, made long ago in the dark, to never become the thing they were hiding from, and kept, at the cost of 200 lives, on the one night it was ever tested. And on the survey ring at the edge of the system, Watcher of Edges Tomu, who was no longer a creature of the pale veil, and was not yet sure what he was, kept his sensors pointed out into the dark, writing down what happened instead of what things were worth, and every so often, for reasons he could not have explained to the register or to himself, he would point them back at the dull gray moon of the human world, the one his people's catalog had measured and called dense and dismissed in a single lazy line, and he would listen, on the long gravity bands, the way you listen for a heartbeat. And every so often, faint and patient and utterly unhurried, he would hear it. A counting song, deep in the stone. 11, and a pause. 11, and a pause. We are still here, the moon said, to anyone foolish enough to come and measure it again. We were always here. And the next time you crack us open to see what we are worth, you will find, beneath the dull gray stone you were so sure was nothing, the same thing the harvest fleet found, the same thing the oldest cold weapon of the pale veil found at the bottom of its long 10,000 years. You will find that we filled the granary, and we held the seam, and we have been waiting, in the dark, for you.